We just closed out an older long-term study, one of the first studies I got when I started my company, and something that really jumped out to me as both interesting and annoying was that we ended up with 5 ISF binders, overflowing, papers busting out of the binder, absolutely ridiculous. Something that remains a big pet peeve in my sort of day-to-day work. So what can we do as sites? Check out Veeva Site Vault. They have the best e-reg system on the market. Best thing about it is that it's free to sites as well. Veeva connects patients, site sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to make clinical trials easier and faster. Veeva is already working with 4,500 sites who use Site Vault. There's more than 400 sponsors who use Veeva's clinical applications. It's pretty wild. I didn't realize until recently that about 65% of all clinical trials are run on Veeva. Look, that's a lot of sites, sponsors, and trials. Again, the best part is Site Vault is completely free to use, so check it out today at sites.veeva.com. This episode is also brought to you in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site network sponsors, and CROs. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful, user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. Real-Time also has amazing customer service, so if you sign up and start using their CTMS, you're not just sort of left on your own to figure it out. They provide a lot of awesome support, so make sure and check them out. They're at realtime-ctms.com. Complete one of the contact forms to get a demo. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Today we have on the show Dr. Michael Koren. He's a practicing cardiologist and the CEO at Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research, which conducts clinical trials across 7 locations in Florida. Received his medical degree cum laude at Harvard Medical School, completed his residency in internal medicine and fellowship in cardiology at New York Hospital / Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center / Cornell Medical Center. He's a fellow of the American College of Cardiology, fellow and 2-time president of the Academy of Physicians in Clinical Research, and the regional chapter of the American Heart Association. The guy's got a ton of experience as an investigator, working in over 2,000 trials. He's co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed articles. Obviously, a very accomplished man. It's kind of cool to go back to somebody who's working at the site level, not just at the site level, but a PI. On a more personal note, Dr. Koren developed a lifelong interest in technology and public health during his time at MIT and the Harvard School of Public Health. He also loves music and has written 2 musical plays. So very cool guy. Really great conversation, although a little on the short side. This week we discuss decentralized clinical trials, clinical research as a care option, and the limitations of using EMR as a screening tool. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Koren. All right, Dr. Michael Koren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brad.
Where are you at?
I am sitting in the mecca of clinical research here in Jacksonville, Florida.
Nice. It's a lot of sites in Jacksonville, Florida area, at least, right?
Florida is a very active place for clinical research, and that's why people west of us turn east a couple of times a day to pay homage.
There you go. I like it. Well, I'm going to jump right in, just like with all our guests. I find it really interesting to hear how people kind of came to the clinical research space. You're obviously a physician, so not necessarily a stretch to be involved in clinical trials, but not a lot of physicians are. We know that that's an issue, right? So if you would, tell us a little bit about your clinical trial origin story, if you would.
Sure. It's an interesting question, something I've actually thought a lot about, and I'm a past president of the Academy of Physicians in Clinical Research. So one of my roles as part of that organization was to make clinical trial work more attractive to physicians, because the fact is we do have a shortage of good clinical trial physicians, particularly in the United States. So it has been an area of thought. Actually, my personal story goes back to medical school, and I was a medical student at Harvard, and I was trying to decide what specialty to go into. It's funny, but medical students are typically pigeonholed, if you will, into different personality types, and their specialty depends on their personality type. So certain people look like pediatricians, and maybe they're very nurturing. Certain people are considered more focused on internal medicine, people that like to be analytical. Some people that may not want to interact with people that much, such as radiologists, have a certain personality type. And people that tend to be decisive tend to be surgeons. So when I was in medical school, I had really a major dilemma about whether or not to go into a surgical specialty or an internal medicine specialty. And personality-wise, I was sort of more surgically oriented. I was, like to do things rapidly. I was a little jockey. I sort of fit into that mold. But I always loved puzzles. And so internal medicine seemed to have more puzzles to me. And I also loved the idea of research. So back in my very early years as a clinician, I made a decision not to do surgery, even though I actually liked that better on a clinical standpoint, but to do internal medicine, then ultimately cardiology, because of puzzle solving and also the richness of research in that area. So I have been interested in research from a pretty tender age in terms of my career development. But I really didn't get exposed to clinical research until I was a cardiology fellow at Cornell. And I had a great opportunity of running a study that involved over 300 patients of folks who had hypertension. And we were very interested to see how their heart size changed during their treatment for hypertension. So I literally was a one-man show. Nowadays we have a coordinator and a PI and a statistician and a regulatory specialist and a recruiter, et cetera. Well, that was me during cardiology fellowship. And I played all those roles, which was an invaluable experience. And actually got to talk to 300 patients, do echocardiograms on them, and make some interesting analytical discoveries about how your heart size changes when you're getting treated for high blood pressure and why that matters.
No, that's awesome. I think that's interesting and probably maybe fairly unique. I would love to see more physicians that have that breadth of experience in dealing with a trial, seeing what a coordinator deals with on a daily basis. That I feel like that's probably fairly unique and probably a great benefit to you. You touched on a couple of things that I find. Well, first of all, calling surgeons decisive is a very diplomatic term. I've worked with a lot of surgeons and cardiologists in my day, and that's I think I might steal that. That's maybe a much nicer way, not nicer word than I would use in some instances.
Fair enough.
But you touched on, there are, obviously, this is a statistic, there's very, very few physicians participating, and it seems like it's getting, worse at times within clinical trials. As a physician, why do you think that is?
It's the hassle factor. Folks that want to get involved in clinical research don't necessarily know what they're getting into. And the clinical research that you get exposed to in your training is very different than what's actually out there. So just to fill in the rest of my story, so I got involved in that clinical research project as a cardiology fellow. And then sort of just by happenstance, I ended up here in Florida in a hybrid job that involved working in a private practice and having a position at the University of Florida. And there was some very interesting things that I learned during that. One is that you can actually do clinical research much more efficiently in a private setting than in an academic setting. And so that became very, very clear very, very early on. And I had some sensibilities of being an entrepreneur and certainly a research focus. And when I put those things together, we developed Jacksonville Center for Clinical Research, which has been a steadily growing company that runs clinical trials now in 8 locations in the state of Florida and has a lot of other areas of business, including CTMS and medical education and other things that we do. So to answer your question is that to get physicians involved, we probably need to do a better job of exposing them to actually what clinical research is at the early stages, because I just happen to luck into it, quite frankly, and perhaps there should be a more systematic way to expose physicians.
Yeah, I started out, at the site level in academia, and it occurred to me that a lot of times the first introduction to research is maybe very different, as you point out, than being involved in a clinical trial. Also, a lot of those institutions have, at least ostensibly, some good infrastructure in place that kind of makes it a little more seamless than a physician who gets out on their own and decides that they want to start doing trials. And they're learning that the barrier of entry is actually pretty high. It can be extremely, extremely challenging. That's something that I love that you're kind of or apparently have leaned into. It sounds like you're operating out of essentially private practices then at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, all of our clinics are standalone research clinics, but they are proximal to practices. So some of them are more or less embedded in the practices, but they're all standalone entities from a business standpoint.
Gotcha. And that's interesting to see. The model does seem to be shifting towards a more embedded, feels like it's shifting towards a more embedded model at this point. And then you've obviously got DCTs becoming the big buzzword. I'm sort of curious as a physician, like what are your thoughts there? I feel like it potentially opens up some, maybe risks for physicians or for PIs to sort of be more detached from where research is happening. But you've also got a whole industry of people saying, oh, patients need options. We need to go, more direct to patient. I guess sort of where do you lie on that spectrum?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something I'm very interested in. I am an amateur historian, so I like to read about history, and I like to think about it, and I like to understand trends. You have that famous Mark Twain saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and this would be a great example of that. So when we talk about decentralized clinical trials, it's real interesting because the history of medical research is actually decentralized clinical trials. And we actually centralize clinical trials to have more institutional control over them. So if you go back to years ago, ancient Greek physicians and middle-aged physicians, they were all kind of working on their own. They're out in the field just doing whatever they could. You take an infamous study like the Tuskegee study, where African Americans in rural areas were basically observed while they suffered consequences of syphilis, and that was done in a decentralized fashion. So actually the physicians and the nurses and the blood drawers went out to the farmers, partially because they didn't want them to come into the institutions and realize, hey, we've invented this thing called penicillin. And so once they came into the institutions, there would be more information available to the subjects, and they may not be, quote, as good subjects anymore because of this knowledge transfer. So, the history of medical research is actually mostly decentralized. And in the more recent years, because of the resources needed at a central location and the institutional controls, we've centralized things. Now, having said that, there's technologies that will be very, very beneficial to get data from outside the central hubs that I think could be invaluable. But I think the concept that there's something intrinsically good to decentralization is probably inaccurate. And the way I like to describe it is that you basically have a research question. There are different ways of answering that research question. And if, quote, decentralized tools help you answer that question, great. But there's nothing intrinsically good or bad about decentralization. You have to look at what the research question is and figure out the best way to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, that's perfectly fair. I think a very balanced take. It just seems like a very, I don't know. It still seems like it's an issue that's still very controversial, I guess, so to speak, especially if you get people who work at sites and then obviously the burgeoning market that's being, propped up by a ton of venture capital, in the sort of DCT space. It's just really fascinating time, I think. But I never considered, I mean, Tuskegee experiment is a great example of a decentralized clinical trial, and certainly not the one they'd want to promote.
And that takes the steam out of a lot of people that are trying to sell decentralized trials. Again, just bring in historical perspective. Again, I have nothing against those folks, and to the extent that home monitoring can give us valuable data, hey, sign me up. That's all good. But at the end of the day, somebody has to be responsible for the integrity of the data. And it's not just software. The other part of that is often overlooked is the value proposition of the patients. So people do things for a reason. And so I giggle, quite frankly, when I see some of the pitches for DCT and they say, well, patients can do a clinical trial from the comfort of their own home. Well, that hasn't really been a value proposition in my experience. In fact, it may be the opposite. One of the value propositions for patients is the socialization elements of being in a clinical trial, feeling like they're in a mecca, feeling like they're in a place where they're going to learn a lot about their condition, so that they're not looking at this necessarily as, okay, I'm going to look at my YouTube videos for the night, and then I'll do my clinical trial 10 minutes before I go to bed because, hey, that's what I do. That's not in their value proposition per se. So again, nothing against collecting data that's outside of the institution, but to think that there has been this heavy demand amongst patients that they want to do clinical trials at home, I just haven't seen. And by the way, that also has been done. So, the Women's Health Initiative is a good example of that. So if you remember, that was a, quote, decentralized trial before we had computers. And basically, people who signed up would get postcards. They would fill out the postcards and write how they're doing and report anything they needed to report. And then they would get blister packet medications that had hormones and other things that they were testing as part of the study, and then kind of report back. So again, you don't need computers to do decentralized trials. So that's another misnomer. So to the extent that in this particular case, it was a study of vitamins and hormones and things, and it was done through the mail, that was decentralized. It worked. There was a lack of certain precision in that trial that would have been more available had these folks come to a clinical research center, but they basically measure what they need to measure, which was, perimenopausal symptoms and other quality of life issues that are easily captured on a postcard. So sometimes bringing technology into the mix actually makes it more complicated for people and limits actually the patient population rather than expanding it.
Yeah, and then, anecdotally, I would tend to agree with that. I think, to a large degree, our patients like coming in, for a variety of different reasons. So, I think that's something that's, I think sort of maybe misrepresented in some cases. But, again, these guys are trying to sell a product, and that's perfect.
Yeah, and that's certainly, I'm a capitalist. I'm okay with that.
There you go. Well, let me ask you about one other thing I often think about is sort of the, not anything new, but the concept of clinical research as a care option, right? Obviously, potentially blurs the lines between research and treatment. But at the same time, there are instances where it may be more appropriate, perhaps oncology, where being offered a clinical trial might be more common or more utilized than other areas. Sort of, again, I'm always kind of curious to hear where people sort of lie on that spectrum as well.
It's a really, really interesting discussion point from a number of standpoints. There's certainly ethical considerations. There are care considerations. There are value proposition considerations, as we discussed earlier, and then just pragmatic issues that arise. So from an ethical standpoint, it's important that people understand that when they're in a clinical trial, we are answering and addressing a research question. That's why they're there. And we don't want to kid them that we're doing something else. We're there and we're helping them. They get free things. But at the end of the day, me and my staff are getting paid by a sponsor to answer a question. And so we want to be very, very clear on that point. So that ethical point has to be understood. Now, having said that, the truth is that there are tremendous resources that go into clinical research that benefit the care of patients. It's just from a pragmatic standpoint, you can't argue otherwise.
Right.
So whether it's a MRI scan that they get that they would never have gotten outside of a study, or access to a medication, or the ear of a coordinator that has way more time than their physician or nurse practitioner. These are all very tangible things that people derive benefit from that are part of healthcare. And there's no two ways around that. So certainly we like to mention that to people, and we're not embarrassed to bring that up as long as they know that the question that we are addressing is one that will be typically addressed in a double-blind fashion, and our job really is to report it to the authorities. But there are a lot of elements of that. So here in our organization has the umbrella name of the ENCORE Research Group, which is an acronym for Encouraging Community-Based Research and Education. And we do things with our database. So we have a large group of patients who we can email on a regular basis. And although we are always talking about getting involved in clinical trials, there are ancillary benefits to come in to be screened for fatty liver disease. Right. There are ancillary benefits to come in and get your lipids checked because we're interested in lipoprotein a studies. And a lot of clinical practices don't necessarily check that since there's perceived to be no solution for that. So these are all bits and pieces of care that we provide on a daily basis that we'd like to let our patient population know about that are clearly benefits to patients. And they can still glean these benefits and participate in a blinded clinical trial.
Yeah, no, well said. I think that's a nice balance of the two there, and that's sometimes nuance gets lost in these conversations, right? And that's again very well said. I want to pick up on something else you mentioned, CTMS. A lot of sites, I mean, hell, unfortunately, a lot of sites are still using cobbled together solutions and Excel spreadsheets, even crazy
Yeah,
things
yeah.
like that. It sounds like you guys developed your own CTMS.
Yes, well, we have a CTMS called Clinisys that's actually been in the marketplace for over 25 years. We actually bought the product when it was a desktop product and made the investment to make it a web-based product. So it is currently a state-of-the-art web-based CTMS that we use and 30 other customers use at this point. And it's been a growing market for us and a business line that we hope to continue to develop. But to your point, it's really, really hard to do a good job in clinical research these days without data. And those data are not only what we're collecting in an individual study, but also how we approach patients. So we talk about this every day. So this morning at our recruiting meeting, I challenged my staff to look at all the fiber scans that were done over the course of the last 2 years in our organization. And we have our own fiber scanner. And then tell me, of all those fiber scans, where did those patients end up in clinical research? Did they get involved in a project at all? If they got involved in a project, did they randomize the project? Were they likely to complete the projects? And so I haven't gotten the answers yet, and hopefully I will soon. But we have, say, 1,000 patients, the last 1,000 patients that we looked at that had fiber scans, where they fit in. And although we believe that it'll help us recruiting for NASH studies, which is, of course, an active area of clinical research, but they also may be an introduction to the research lifestyle, if you will, and an example of information that people get by having some sort of allegiance to a community-based research center. So again, without CTMS, you would never be able to get the answers to those kind of questions.
Yeah, well, and that's an ideal way of utilizing. It's not just CTMS does a lot of things potentially, or very few things potentially, depending on how you decide to utilize it. So to be, actually using it to continue engagement with your patients is huge, and probably something, if I had to guess, probably underutilized by a lot of research sites.
Yeah, no doubt.
And I've been seeing a lot of conversations too around things like EMR to EDC. For us, we work with a lot of different community physicians. They'll use different EMRs. EMRs are not always the most accurate thing in the world either. I find it's sort of, you get out what's put in, which is not always the good stuff. So do you feel like something like that is going to really move the needle much in terms of clean data collection, or even potentially recruitment?
Yeah, your point is well made. Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
And there's all this hype and discussion about how artificial intelligence is going to revolutionize medicine. And quite frankly, we've had computers in medicine for 40 years, 50 years, and it hasn't revolutionized anything. It's just gotten people more confused by and large, unfortunately. And part of that is the point you're making is that, and I am certainly a contributor to that. So when you're using EMRs, you're just trying to get through your day. And you're just clicking on whatever's most convenient, and it may not be the most accurate, but you're clicking through it. And now I'm still old school, so I don't just believe on clicking things, and I put narratives in all my notes, etc. But unfortunately, my narratives, which are actually the best reflection of how I'm thinking and the best reflection of truth, are not easily put into databases.
Yeah, unstructured data.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we have a long, long way to go before the average EMR is really a major benefit to us recruiting patients. Now, having said that, we use them on a day-to-day basis, and it helps, but it's still a very rough screening tool. And I've gone to presentations where people think that you can find the perfect patient using EMR. And my comment to burst that bubble is to say, okay, you go through 1,000 patients and you find 2 perfect patients on EMR. There's something that you don't know about them that's the most important thing. And I asked them to guess what that is, and of course they can never guess. And the answer to that is, do they want to do a clinical trial?
Right.
Which would be the first question if you are recruiting for clinical trials. So before you even look at any diagnosis or anything else, you should be having an understanding about whether or not the patient would be interested and willing to do a clinical trial. Because otherwise you spend a lot of time and effort and people are going to hang up on you when you try to reach out to them, or be irritated at you because, like, why in the world would you put me in this research study? You must not care about me as a doctor because you're putting me into a study just like the Tuskegee victims.
Right.
Those notions are out there, unfortunately. And again, I'm a big proponent of using information technology. I'm the owner of an IT company and actually have a U.S. patent in medical IT. So I'm vested in the space, but I'm also realistic. And the real element of using these products is to know your patients and to use this information as an adjunct to your message and your pitch to the patients. And then more broadly, as a community-based research center, is to just talk about research to the community. So we do a lot of community outreach here. We just talk about general medical issues. Obviously, with the whole COVID crisis over the last few years, there's been multiple opportunities to talk about vaccines and where they fit in, who they're good for, who they're bad for. Do you just listen to the government, or do you listen to something on the internet, or somewhere in between? And so people are really desperate to find places where they can get to the truth. And we've done a lot of work in that. In fact, we've branded all of our teachings in our educational modules to something called MedEvidence, which has, just like this discussion, a balanced discussion about pros and cons of things and help understand the principles behind making medical decisions.
But ultimately, what you're doing is, you're laying the groundwork for the potential for patients to have an interest in clinical trials before you are even approaching them about a clinical trial, right? I mean, you're putting the education out there. You're engaging, not just walking in when you need something from a patient, which again I think is just horribly underappreciated, because it's so often run a query, find patients, call them. Half of them are pissed off that you're calling them. Why are you looking at my medical records? What are you doing?
Right.
I don't have that, whatever the case may be.
Right.
We've heard it all. So, actually investing on the front end versus just trying to do something transactional after the fact, which again, I hate to say that, I feel like that's sorely underappreciated.
Right. Well, the beauty of the RCTMS, I'm sure others like it, are that they don't go into the database if they're not interested in research.
Right.
So we've gotten across that hurdle to begin with, which is really a massive hurdle. So the concept of just the general EMR finding research patients, again, has some interest and value potentially, but there are very, very big barriers that need to be overcome.
So if you were to, let's say you're a gambling man, over the next 5 years, I mean, what do you think is going to be the way forward? Obviously there's AI and there's DCT and there are, all kinds of other new things trying to come to market. If you had to guess, where would you think we're going to see the most success or the most sort of evolution in terms of clinical trials?
My bet would be it's something that I'm not thinking of right at the moment.
Perfectly fair.
But the way the world works is that the things that are hyped will tend to fail spectacularly, but they'll lay the groundwork for the thing that succeeds. So again, I do think that some of the vendors that are pushing DCT, and we've already had these experiences, will find it's a lot more difficult than they think, that their promises will not be fulfillable. On the other hand, having remote capabilities will have some value.
Of course.
Once we figure out how to meld those things, we will make progress. But progress is steady, and it happens in steps, and some of those steps are downwards.
That's true. It's always forward, whether it be up or down, but forward nonetheless. I have one more question I want to get your take on that I find, again, sort of really interesting right now, is sort of the new entrance into the space in terms of retail pharmacy, right? So CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, I think even now at this point. Pretty sure. I think my gas station on the corner I saw is doing clinical trials now. No, just kidding. But yeah, how do you feel there? I mean, is this another great opportunity, or potentially sort of someone walking into a space they think they can get their arms around, only to find that it's going to be much more challenging?
I don't know. My guess is that they'll find that it's going to be more challenging. But I think the bigger thing is they'll find they're not making any money doing it, and they'll stop doing it.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfectly valid point. I'm curious if they'll wait the 6 months we sometimes have to fight to get our payments.
Right. So selling data is probably the easy part of it, and they do make money doing that. We get those data, and I'll share with you one anecdote. So we were working with a company that used Google Analytics to find some patients, and they sent us, I forget exactly how many patients, but let's say they sent us about 200 patients that were identified using Google Analytics. And again, these are just made up numbers, but let's say that I think it was like 20 of those 200 that they, quote, pre-screened actually got into a study. So that's 20 patients. So let's say we had 20 randomized patients. So I went to a meeting, they were showing this off, and they were, beating their chest about it. I asked them a simple question: how much did it cost you to get those 20 patients? And so they kind of whispered in the corner, and they were, I guess, a little bit embarrassed, et cetera, et cetera. But the answer finally came out. They spent $200,000. So I said, okay, you just spend $10,000 a patient for each randomized patient. In that therapeutic area, we've actually looked at how much we spend, and that's $1,500.
Right.
So again, when you start looking at the cost effectiveness of these things, it may turn out to be very, very different than the initial hype.
Yeah, the juice is not always worth the squeeze, I suppose.
Exactly.
Well, fair enough. Well, Doctor, I really want to thank you for your time. Anything as we sort of wind down here that you want to? No,
keep up the good work. Get the word out. We need to get more people, more clinicians, and just smart people involved in clinical trials. It's an important industry. We do God's work every day. So keep up the good work.
I could not agree more. Thank you so much, Dr. Koren.
Bye-bye.
As always, thank you so much for listening to Note to File Podcast. Make sure to check us out at notetofilepodcast.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks.